Hi, welcome to the Mind Report. I'm Laurie Santos, professor of psychology at Yale University.
And I'm Jesse Bering. I'm a writer for Scientific American and for Slate Magazine, and I'm a psychologist.
And today, Jesse and I are going to be talking about the cognitive science of sexual perversion. For those that don't know, Jesse, a few years ago, wrote a book called Why is the Penis Shaped Like That? And Other Reflections on Human Nature. Now he's actually working on a book on the cognitive science of sexual perversion, where he's going to try to take an evolutionary approach to some of our species' strangest sexual behaviors. So Jesse, just to get us started, tell me a little bit about how you got interested in sexual perversions in the first place.
Well, I cover a lot of ground in the Scientific American column that I write, and quite a bit of it deals with human sexuality because I just happen to find it fascinating. And I wrote a couple of columns about some unusual or atypical types of sexual orientations, and a lot of people would hesitate to use that phraseology, orientation, to refer to something like zoophilia, where people are attracted to animals, or even something like asexuality, where people have no attraction to men or women. But I think this term orientation really fits. I mean, this is what people are oriented to, these particular deviant categories of a sexual target. Anyway, I read a couple of columns, and one in particular was a column about a man that was attracted to horses, and I found it odd, I found it strange, I found it interesting, because the guy actually he'd written to me an email, a personal email, laying out his particular, he wouldn't use the word perversion, but his particular attraction and sort of how he felt it came about in his early adolescence. He said he would go to the library and he would, check out books on horses, illustrated volumes of horses, and he would masturbate to that, whereas most adolescent males would be looking at Playboy or something like that.
Right.
And he grew up in a suburban house. He grew up to be a doctor. I mean, it wasn't like some crazy rural farmhand or something like that. And he didn't understand it either. Anyway, writing columns like that and getting the reactions that I got from readers, very strong reactions, as you probably would expect, I felt like this was a really interesting sort of direction to go to take a book. So I wrote this book, Perv, The Sexual Deviant in All of Us, which is coming out in October this year.
Cool. And I've actually got a chance to see a couple of the chapters before the book was out. And the one I read most recently was actually a nice treatise on the connection between sexuality and disgust.
Yes.
So in the chapter, you point out this funny paradox, which is that for natural selection to get sexual reproduction off the ground, we have to be kind of fitting various orifices together, but we're also a species that's built to kind of be disgusted by human bodies. And so you talked about a neat way that you think natural selection kind of got around this problem. Do you want to speak about that a bit?
Right. So disgust, I think, is a really core, potent emotion when it comes to sexual morality. You probably experienced just a bit of that when I was talking about having sex with horses or people who were aroused by horses just a moment ago.
Yeah, I was trying not to make disgust faces on the blogging heads, but minds do what they do.
So disgust, I think, functions in two general ways when we're talking about sexuality and sexual mores. One is simply the sort of visceral, bodily, fluid type of disgust, the sort of corporeal disgust, when we're actually thinking about exchanging fluids or interacting through copulation, like animals essentially, with another person. And it is disgusting if you think about it in too much detail. And then there's the type of disgust that's more sort of symbolic, more abstract, people who get morally disgusted, sort of this moral loathing. I'm disgusted by your sexual behavior. So when we violate some type of sexual norm, whether that's by having sex with an animal, in this case the horse, or through sexual coercion like rape or sexually harming a child or something like that, you oftentimes hear this word, I'm disgusted by your disgusting, in that sense too. So I think that we've got these two domains of disgust when we're talking about sexuality. Again, one bodily related and one sort of morally related. So maybe we'll talk about the bodily one first. I think that's what you were asking about.
Yeah, because presumably that's the one that came around first, right? In the sense that natural selection was probably building in disgust for all kinds of reasons, but sort of protecting us sexually might have been one of them, right?
Right. So in the non-sexual domain, when we're thinking about bodily contaminants, pathogens and interacting with other people's bodily fluids and so on, we have a natural aversion to that. Even people that we are close to, it's not. We don't oftentimes like to. Well, I mean, I probably have I'm probably more disgusted more easily than a lot of people. And I remember growing up, I wouldn't eat food off my mother's plate or, share a glass with my brother or something like that because I was just very germophobic, essentially. And so when you have that type of disgust reaction, which I think, there's a gradient in terms of the degree to which we're disgusted by those types of things, but everybody sort of is disgusted at some level by these nasty bodily products that other people have produced. So to have sex with somebody, we really have to get over that, essentially. So one thing that natural selection did to sort of enable us to be the sexually reproductive organisms that we are is to dampen our disgust response through sexual arousal. So when we're sexually aroused, the argument that I make in this book is that we have a sort of our disgust becomes anesthetized. Anesthetized at this sort of local level in terms of the person that we're attracted to that is sexually arousing us in order to have sex with that person, therefore in order to sexually reproduce. That is, if you're heterosexual, at least. If you're homosexual, if you're gay, it just kind of lets you have good sex to get over that. But
one of the points you make in the book is that but one of the points you make in the book is that it's really, really local, right? It's not that we just become less disgusted in general when we're aroused. It's that somehow natural selection's figured out a mechanism to shut off disgust about other person's bodies or this one person's body specifically. Right.
So when you're really aroused, it allows you to have sex. But like I said, it's anesthetized. It's not your disgust response is not under general anesthesia. It's under local anesthesia. It's kind of it's put out for a particular period of time. But if something happens that's extremely disgusting that you're not expecting as you're having sex, you have this sort of erotic kill switch. So let's say that you're in the middle of performing oral sex on your partner and you realize that, those genitals aren't the color that they really should be. I think there's something wrong with this person. They have a venereal disease or something like that. You get disgusted. It's an overwhelming feeling of disgust, and your arousal basically just sort of shuts off at that point. So your disgust is kind of watered down. It's not turned off entirely. It's still alert at some sort of distant level for these emergency types of situations, because it obviously would be quite maladaptive if you saw such a blatant sign of disease like that and you continued with the sexual act anyway.
Right. And your claim is that this is sort of an old system, this sort of local anesthetic for sexual arousal acting as local anesthetics, pretty old, right? You even identify it in other animals too, right?
Right. So phylogenetically, this would be a fairly ancient mechanism if you think about it, because this is not just a problem that would be unique to human beings, but to any species that reproduces sexually as well. And there have been some studies that I talk about in the book, studies with rats, where if a male rat is copulating with a female rat, and you inject it with lithium chloride so that it gets extremely nauseous very quickly, it stops copulating, but it also stops copulating for a fairly long period of time. It develops an aversion to sexual behavior with other female rats for the next, probably a couple of weeks or so before it returns. The sexual drive returns, and copulation can resume again. So it's a sort of it's kind of similar to taste aversion learning. Conditioned taste aversion, but it just simply is in the domain of sexuality. But if you shock the rat or you torture it some other cruel way, it doesn't have that effect. It's only disgust that has that really sort of potent effect of turning off the sex drive for a period of time.
Yeah, and I actually like sort of hearing those studies in the book, in part because I think it brings us to this sort of funny puzzle about human sexual disgust as it differs from animal sexual disgust, right? Because it seems like other animals might have these kinds of cases that we're talking about where because of physical disgust, they can sort of shut off arousal or vice versa, but they don't seem to do the same kind of thing that the human species does in terms of moral disgust and connecting that with sexuality. Do you have a sense of why we might see some of those kinds of differences? I mean, so for example, take, our rhesus monkeys. I doubt they would find it sexually disgusting to evaluate some of their third-party monkeys' actions, right? They don't necessarily care what some other monkey is doing. They might themselves feel disgusted and not want to mate with a particular monkey, but they don't seem to kind of morally evaluate the sexual choices of other monkeys, at least that we can tell so far.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I suppose it would be difficult to assess that too accurately because of the language difficulties, obviously. But in terms of their behavior, they don't seem to display some sort of ostracism to other monkeys that engage in some sort of deviant sexual behavior. Is that correct? They wouldn't seem to stigmatize the other monkey that is a pervert in some noticeable way, anyway. So yes, this does seem to be a uniquely human phenomenon. This type of disgust, this sort of symbolic disgust. And it isn't entirely clear why. I mean, we see this symbolic disgust in other moral domains, work by Bruce Hood, for example, or Paul Rosen, where you see people that don't want to wear the clothes of somebody who's committed some sort of heinous crime. Think of wearing Jerry Sandusky's sweater or something. Somebody that has committed some sort of moral offense. Their actual objects have been tainted somehow. We don't want to have any sort of physical contact with those objects because it's somehow imbued the essence of that evil or that immorality. And we see something similar to that with sexuality as well, although there are some caveats there. I mean, one sort of very obvious example of this is women who have been raped. You oftentimes see this depiction of them, crouched in the corner of the shower, scrubbing themselves clean because they feel dirty. They feel like they've been contaminated somehow because of this offensive act that's been committed against them. And in fact, that's not just a myth or a stereotype. 70% of women who have been raped report scrubbing, sort of trying to cleanse themselves morally through these, through using soap in the shower or something for months after the event. So there is this sort of phenomenon where the sexual transgression somehow begins to contaminate the self, either the person that's actually been sexually assaulted, or the person that's committed the sexual offense themselves can feel dirty in that way too. And it isn't entirely clear evolutionarily where or why that's happened. There are, it's easy, I think, to speculate. One is that simply this moral loathing type of phenomenon would help us to identify others that are likely to engage in these types of behaviors in the future, and for us to mark them or to ostracize them or not to trust them in the future because they've kind of already exhibited these types of sexual transgressions. And I mean, you really can't think of a more important or more strategic domain of social knowledge than the sexual domain and what people are likely to do.
Yeah, and one of the things you review in the chapter that I read is also that the sexual arousal can also be a local anesthetic in some ways for sometimes moral disgust as it comes to sex, not just physical disgust, right? You talked about some studies by Dan Ariely and colleagues kind of looking at this. Do you want to review some of those?
Yeah, so some of the more interesting studies involve basically getting participants, typically college students, sexually aroused somehow, actually putting them in some type of laboratory conditions where they become lustful, and see how that phenomenology, that psychological state, actually affects their decision making or their behaviors and how they interact with others and the types of things that they're willing or not willing to do. So Dan Ariely's sort of famous study, it was an article published a couple of years ago. It was called "In the Heat of the Moment," I think was the name of the article. Basically compared two groups of male undergraduate students. One group, the control group, just simply got a list of sexual behaviors essentially, and it was sort of on a scale of 0 to 7 or something. How willing or unwilling would you be to do this or not? So the examples were things like have sex with a morbidly obese woman, have sex with a 12-year-old, have a threesome with another man. These were straight undergraduate students. have sex with a woman who was in her 70s, things like that. Things that most your average college student would say, no, I would never do that. That's disgusting, or that's completely against my morals, or something along those lines. So in the control group, they were, they pretty much answered that way. But for the college students that were sexually aroused before answering these questions, they basically looked at a bunch of porn. And the researchers told them, get as excited or aroused as you possibly can, but please kindly refrain from having an orgasm, and then answer these questions. So they were in this, they're basically as worked up or as turned on as they possibly could be, and then they answered that same set of questions. And surprisingly or not surprisingly, depending on sort of how you think about these things, those males who were highly aroused were much more open-minded about these possibilities in terms of whether they'd be willing to do them or not than those in the control condition. They said that they would be willing to do this, basically, at least at a significant level statistically.
Right. But some of the neat thing is that these aren't just cases of things that you might find just physically disgusting, right, from a sexual perspective.
These are social, moral, sort of sexual transgressions, I suppose, or things that would be stigmatized in terms of normal sexuality in the everyday domain. Right.
Or sometimes even morally stigmatized. I think there are certain things on the list, too, that are like, would you continue pushing a woman to have sex after she's already had no, and things like that. Things that,
So when men are, I guess the evolutionary argument is that it would have been most adaptive, just from a cost-benefit analysis, for men who were extraordinarily aroused to go forward with the act, essentially, no matter what, unless there was some sort of really sort of potent, physically disgusting thing that would shut off their erotic arousal. And when you think about it, from a evolutionary perspective, males have an unlimited supply, essentially, of sperm cells. So it's kind of like, why not? If there's any remote possibility of impregnating this person, why not go ahead and just sort of go through with the act? So it becomes very difficult at this sort of social moral level, because we're sort of in conflict with our more ancient evolutionary mechanisms to not do something that would have these very harmful effects on the well-being of another person, or come back to hurt us in terms of our reputation down the road.
Yeah, you were careful there to say men, right? So this is another thing you brought up in the chapter, right? Is that some of these mechanisms might work differently, or it would make evolutionary sense for these mechanisms to work differently across the sexes. Do we know if these mechanisms work in the same way as women? I imagine it's just hard to do the study where you bring women into the lab and.
No, there are some studies actually where they've induced sexual arousal in women using various mechanisms, both by sort of vignettes, sort of erotic vignettes, but also by porn, and also just sort of interacting with people that they would be attracted to. And you find the same general pattern that you find with men in the sense of this local anesthesia. They're less disgusted by these sort of bodily these bodily types of stimuli that enables them to go forward and actually have sex. But we also find that there are nuances with female disgust as well, so that women who are at high risk of conception, women who are ovulating basically, are more easily disgusted than women who are not at that stage of the month. So there have been, they're not the greatest studies. They're mostly the sort of questionnaire studies. So you've got these women that are answering these questions who are currently ovulating versus women that are at other phases of the cycle. And women who are ovulating find these more deviant sexual categories to be more inherently disgusting than women who are not ovulating. So, you ask them questions that are similar to the Ariely studies. And I'm thinking specifically of a study by Daniel Fessler and Carlos David Navarrete, where they asked these women, how disgusting is it for a woman to have sex with an 80-year-old man, or to have sex with an animal, or things like that. Very similar questions to the Ariely study, but with women in this case. And the women who are ovulating found these types of things more disgusting, generally speaking, than women who were not ovulating. And their argument, Dan Fessler's argument, is that when women are at high risk of conception, it would be more adaptive for them to be more easily disgusted. So their disgust response is sort of hyper-vigilant at that period because they're making these critical adaptive decisions. Do I have sex with this person because I might get pregnant? It's not terribly adaptive to have sex with somebody who's, an 80-year-old man if that man might not even survive the length of your pregnancy to help you raise whatever offspring you may have. Unless the person is, ridiculously wealthy, and then we leave you the money.
Maybe the Anna Nicole Smith on our hands,
that's the Anna Nicole Smith
yeah.
strategy. But for if you look at these types of things as these are lingering after effects of the ancestral past, these things evolved over 100,000 years ago. Then, and we're still operating with these biases today. That's what we find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is another thing I think you try to go through in the chapter a lot, even though there's not that much data on it, right? Which is not how these things come about over the evolutionary past, but how they come out over development. Because one of the things you talk about is that there's certain things that probably get us disgusted that are just kind of built in and universal, but there's lots of other things about different sexual practices that may or may not disgust us that seem to be really culturally bound.
Right.
So in the book, in the chapter, you talk about a couple of these cases that, at least from my Western eyes, seem very culturally a bit strange, but are just sort of perfectly accepted sexual practices in other parts of the world, so that are kind of fine. Do you want to talk about some of these kinds of differences?
Right. So, so my argument in this particular chapter that we're talking about is that we do need to learn certain types of disgust. We do need to learn how to be disgusted by certain types of stimuli. And others are more sort of inborn or innate. So cross-culturally, you won't find a society where vivid incarnations of venereal disease aren't inherently disgusting to people, or pubic lice or things that are disgusting, sort of at that bodily, corporeal, visceral level. Those are disgust phenomena or stimuli that we don't need to learn. But there are other types of things that we are disgusted by in the sexual domain at this sort of moral level that do seem to require some degree of cultural input, or I'm not sure I would say indoctrination, but at least enculturation to produce this type of very strong, emotionally powerful, you disgust me sort of response to people that have transgressed our sexual morality. So, like you said, I give a couple of examples in the book. One is if you think about semen sort of being, as this sort of disgusting substance, if you're not aroused particularly, if you just think about semen, seminal fluid, it does seem quite gross. In fact, we didn't talk about this, but there's several other studies on disgust, and one was basically asking female college students how disgusted they would be to swallow ejaculate, and women who were not aroused, it was kind of absolutely disgusting to even think about swallowing fresh ejaculate when you're not in the mood. Maybe when you're like super worked up or super turned on, maybe you might swallow somebody's seminal fluid when you're performing oral sex or something like that. But
just at the normal dinner table
when you're not in the mood,
buffet,
it's hideous. It's disgusting to even think about, right?
Right.
So, so when we hear about societies where ingesting seminal fluid is sort of a normal daily routine, it seems quite puzzling to us. This is a very well-known, sort of famous example at this point. In Papua New Guinea, there are some societies where prior to their adolescence, boys about the age of 8 or 9 are sort of ushered off into these bachelor huts, where every day, basically, they're performing fellatio on older adolescents or adult males in the community and swallowing these men's semen. And the folk logic or the wisdom is that by swallowing semen, they basically become masculinized and they become fierce warriors. So if you ask them, it's not a homosexual behavior whatsoever. It's just, this is what you need to do for boys to grow up to be these fighters, to defend the community, to become very threatening and so on. So they actually, these young men basically become, they're swallowing lots of semen every day, which sounds absolutely disgusting to us, but for them, somehow that disgust response has been diluted it's just become sort of a ritualized behavior for them. If you think about that same ritual happening in our society, 8 or 9-year-old boys swallowing the semen of men to become adults, it's unspeakable. That's where we find this sort of moral disgust and sort of moral loathing phenomenon. So the fact that we experience that moral disgust in our society, and not just our society, but in most places around the world, I think, whereas in these tribes in Papua New Guinea, this is something that is, if you don't allow a boy to do this, that's seen as inducing harm in that child, because you're basically sort of identifying that child as a weakling, and not somebody that's not worthy of sort of taking on a masculine role in society. There's obviously some cultural learning that's happening under those types of conditions. There's another. Do we know anything about? I'll give another case of seminal fluid ingestion where there was a guy in a recent case in Pennsylvania, I think, where a man was accused and ultimately sentenced to several years in prison for inserting some of his own semen into yogurt containers of his coworkers.
It's bad.
I think they noticed at some point some odd taste, and they sort of did an analysis of the yogurt container and found out that this guy was actually injecting through a syringe his fluid in the tinfoil lids of these yogurt containers, which is disgusting, and the judge thought it was absolutely disgusting and said it was the most despicable thing he'd ever seen in all of his years on the bench. But there are other societies where you find, if you were to approach a local sage in one of these societies, I think in Egypt, there was a society where they basically advised men who were smitten by a particular woman to hide surreptitiously some of their own semen in the woman's food, and this would be sort of a magic formula for her falling in love with them. And the woman would actually not be disgusted by this, but she would be flattered by it. So clearly there are cultural differences that indicate that not all of this is innate and impervious to social learning.
Right. And the other set of individual differences you look at aren't at the cultural level, but really at the individual level. I mean, this is sort of one of the things about the title of the book, right, is like looking at individual cases of sexual perversions or particular orientations that might be seen as deviant to most of the other folks in the population. Did these kind of come about the same way? Do we know anything about the development of some of these kinds of things?
Right. I do talk quite a bit about individual differences. And, we find even in individual differences with disgust. And I mentioned earlier that I'm probably more easily sexually disgusted than other people. But most of the research on individual differences in disgust, at least, have been with women who are experiencing or have a history of vaginismus, which means that they basically consciously they want to have sex with their partner, but they just simply can't do so physically. Their bodies won't allow vaginal entry essentially to their partner's penis or finger or anything like that. And some of the most recent work suggests that women who do have this vaginismus that don't have a history of some sort of post-traumatic stress history of being raped or something that can explain this type of reaction, but have always had these problems, actually have a much more heightened disgust sensitivity than women that aren't prone to this particular sexual disorder. So it does have effects sort of at this individual level as well. And, and part of the argument is that maybe these women aren't, maybe the solution for these women is they're not aroused enough during the sexual act. If you can somehow get them aroused enough, then then their anesthesia will basically sort of kick in and allow them to engage in intercourse. But so those are individual differences with disgust. But yeah, there are lots of individual differences in terms of our own, our own sexualities, or what we're particularly attracted to or oriented to, our perversions and so on. And I talk quite a bit about some of the more unusual paraphilias and fetishes, and the developmental origins of those and sex differences between those. And one of the most
talk a little bit about that stuff, because I think this is one of the puzzles, right, for developing a good science of some of this stuff, is that it's actually hard to figure this stuff out because we can't use our normal empirical tools to develop a particular sexual perversion.
So paraphilias are a bit of a mystery, and maybe I should define this term paraphilia. I'm sure most people know what this is, but a paraphilia is basically having a sexual orientation, a primary arousal towards something outside of the norm, basically, and that's what it literally translates to. And really, at last count, I think there were well over 500 documented paraphilias, and some of these cases, being attracted to bananas or something like that, is. They're so rare. There are like 2 or 3 people in the world that have them, but nevertheless, there are people that are more attracted to these categories than they are healthy, attractive, reproductively mature human beings. And like you said,
and so the norm would be defined as being attracted to other people's genitals. Is that right? Because it's not. I mean, you see some of these paraphilias that are oriented towards other body parts, just not genitals, right?
Right, that's partialism. Partialism is a type of paraphilia where you're attracted to a particular body part on your partner or other people. So it's not the genitals, which is not considered a paraphilia if you're attracted primarily to a person's genitals. That's that's within the norm. But these are people who are more aroused by feet, for example, than they are a person's genitals, or more aroused by calves or nipples or chins or noses or earlobes. I mean, anything you could possibly imagine, there are partialists for every part of the body. And their desire for these body parts exceeds that of their attraction to or their desire to actually interact with the person's genitals. So it's not having sexual intercourse per se that's most attractive to them. It's interacting with these other body parts. Feet, the attraction to feet, or podophilia it's called, is the most common type of partialism. And this has to be distinguished from people that just simply have like a fetish. A fetish is hard to describe actually, but people are oftentimes more attracted to genitals than they are feet, but feet still turn them on a little bit. It's just that it's not the primary source of their arousal. But a partialist is they prefer this body part over the genitals.
Got it.
And there's a strange, not so strange, really. Maybe on the surface it sounds that way, but an evolutionary theory for partialism. It doesn't make a lot of sense why you would be attracted to feet, for instance, over genitals in terms of your sexual reproduction. You can't really impregnate toes, and
right.
And the argument was made in the mid '80s by a guy at Ohio State called James Giannini, and he did this sort of socio-cultural historical analysis where he looked at the rise of foot fetishism throughout history, and he found these sort of peaks and valleys when there were epidemics of venereal disease. There was similarly sort of an emphasis on the sexualization of the female foot. So during the Spanish Inquisition, for example, you wouldn't really expect people to be, you wouldn't expect artists at that period of time in history to be specializing in portraits of painting women's feet, but they were. And this is also the point in time in history when we find shoes that revealed toe cleavage in women to be especially hot, to really sort of burst onto the scene. And over hundreds of years, you find this. Whenever there's a venereal disease that sort of flares up, you find more people that are attracted to feet, and then it goes away. You find sort of a reduction in podophilia. Then you find it coming back again in the next bout of some type of epidemic. So he found this sort of interesting trend, and his argument basically was that men who were more likely to become partialist would have had less frequent interactions with diseased genitalia that could either kill them or render them infertile. But they still had to have some degree of attraction to the woman's, to actually have sex and reproduce. It's just that they wouldn't be primarily attracted to those hot spots on the body.
Well, that evolutionary explanation seems to be a little puzzling, right? Because one of the things that we know about some of these partialisms is that they seem to emerge really early in development too, right? So they seem to be the kinds of things that stick around that you wouldn't just kind of learn as you sort of figure out the sexual territory as an adult.
Yeah, so this would be, so it's not like a deliberate or strategic plan to sort of become a partialist. It's something that you would have to have a genetic predisposition to actually become a partialist through some type of developmental process. And one of the most
do we know if these things are heritable? Oh, sorry, I was going to ask about heritability of some of these things. Do we know any of that, or?
There are very few heritability studies on sexual deviance or paraphilias. There's some degree of concordance, but it's not terribly convincing. And part of the difficulty in studying these types of questions, as you mentioned, was, there are all sorts of ethical problems. Well, let me tell you sort of what researchers think is happening in terms of the origins of the paraphilias and how they come about developmentally. First of all, one really revealing clue is that paraphilias and fetishes are disproportionately a male phenomenon. Some have estimated it's 99-1 basically, 99 male paraphiliacs to every one female. So men seem to be much more likely to develop a sort of fixed arousal pattern to some sort of deviant sexual category than women are. The only exception to that is the sadomasochistic category, where the difference is more on the order of 20 men to every one woman. But even for sadomasochism, there are far more female masochists than there are female sadists. So there are differences there as well. And another revealing clue is that if you interview through these case studies, clinical case studies, people that are attracted to things that are outside of the norm. You ask these adult men when they sort of became aware of their this sort of attraction to or their orientation to these categories, or whether they thought there was a discrete moment in time where it sort of pulled the switch that led them that way or another. You find that it's really early emerging in development. It's between the ages of about 4 and 9. This is when most men say that something happened to them during that developmental window that pushed them in this sort of paraphilic direction. And it's probably better thought of as like a sort of a sensitive time frame, 4 to 9. It's probably not. It's not a critical developmental period. So there's probably a couple of years on either end of that scale where things can still have an effect on your adult sexuality. But in the book, I give several examples of adult men that have these anomalous patterns of sexual attraction that can remember things that happened to them at this early period in their childhood, their boyhood, that change things forever for them. And one is the case of a man that is a chromophiliac, which is basically somebody who is attracted to amputees. And he remembered when he was a young boy, and his physician father had this, a vast library in his office, and he would sort of look through all the pictures in the book of these medical textbooks, and he found his first naked woman that he saw basically was a sort of a clinical case study of an attractive woman, but she happened to have an amputated leg, and this was he happened to get aroused by this at the time when he was looking at these images, and he was probably about 6 years old, and from that point forward, he says that was his ideal woman, and he had a very specific type of woman that he would be attracted to, which is a woman who had a amputation below the knee. He didn't want any woman. He didn't want women with double amputations or an amputated arm. It had to be a woman with an amputated leg below the knee. And so there are loads of stories like that, and the difficulty, like you alluded to earlier, is that we can't do these controlled experiments where you really try to pinpoint the cause of paraphilia in men by randomly assigning, one group of boys at birth to be in the control condition where they have a normal sexual development and another where they've got these sort of anomalous experiences developmentally, and just, wait 15 or 20 years and see what happens. To see if they turn into zoophiles or pedophiles or chronomophiles or something like that. You just can't do it. So you can't do it ethically. No parent in the right mind is obviously going to let you do something like that. Even though, in principle, we could answer these questions by doing controlled studies like that, they just can't be done from an ethical perspective. Which is and
do we know anything about the development of this stuff in animals? Like, do we see these kinds of either partialisms or...
so the ethical constraints are a little less restricted with animals, I suppose, and there have been a couple of studies where where researchers have basically bred or cultivated paraphilia-like traits or behaviors in other species. One study with ungulates, sheep and goats, basically these baby sheep and these baby goats were sort of switched at birth, so they were raised by the opposite species. Newborns of both sexes, male and female, goats and sheep, were raised by the opposite species. And then when those young sheep and goats became reproductively mature, they were reunited with their birth species, their real species, and given an opportunity to mate with them. You find this really interesting gender effect where, for both the sheep and the goats, the females that were raised by the opposite species were willing to reproduce with males of either species, sex or good. So basically, they went both ways in terms of their attraction to one or the other species. But the males who were switched at birth in both species only displayed an arousal pattern to the species that they were raised by. So whatever they grew up with is what they were attracted to. They had no attraction to their natal or birth species, which is we have to stop short of making too strong of inferences to human sexuality. Right. It is quite revealing that you find these strong gender effects with other species as well, where the males seem to be sexually imprinted during their development.
More so than females.
In a way that isn't reversible. Basically, you're sort of stamped permanently by this experience, this anomalous experience sexually. You're imprinted, and you can't go back and change it. And it happens very early in development. Whereas females, even though they have the same anomalous experience, they're more plastic or fluid erotically. So they retain this plasticity for being aroused by a broader variety of stimuli.
And this is consistent in humans too, right? Where females, on average, tend to be aroused by more kinds of things than men?
Right. So if you look at arousal studies in human beings, adult humans, non-paraphilic humans anyway, men and women, men are... so if you hook a man up to a physiological device to study their sexual arousal, a penile plethysmograph, basically, it sort of is an erection detection mechanism, and you show them pictures of their preferred sex. If they're gay, you show them pictures of men. If they're straight, you show them pictures of women. Well, the gay men will only get erections to other men. The straight men will only get erections to women. So it's very much in line with their own conscious awareness of their sexual orientation. For women, however, who are given these physiological measures of arousal, vaginal vasocongestion in particular, they will show genital arousal not just to what they say they're attracted to, so not just their orientation, but to all sorts of things. If a woman is a lesbian, she'll display vaginal arousal to images of naked men. If she's a heterosexual woman, she'll display genital arousal to pictures of naked women. Both lesbians and straight women display sexual arousal to graphic depictions of bonobos, other primates having sex. So you find this sort of erotic plasticity effect with human beings as well. Yeah. So and the argument is that it's an evolutionary argument. It's quite contentious, I think, but the best explanation is that women would have been natural selection would have worked on this process in the sense of women should, anytime there was sort of an overt cue to sex happening sort of in their immediate social environment, they should have those women that actually would display some genital arousal that would ultimately be associated with lubrication, vaginal lubrication, would have been an adaptive mechanism to prevent physical damage from rape.
I see. And so the claim is that women should be just arousable in general more often than men because it's potentially protective. Is that, yeah.
But the important thing to note is that they're not always conscious of their genital arousal. So women, they might be displaying these signs of vaginal arousal, but they're not as in tune with what's happening down below as a man is in terms of the disconnect between consciousness and unconsciousness in terms of arousal. So they might say that a woman who's displaying arousal to a bonobo, it's not to say that she's literally physically attracted to bonobos. It's just that that's how her body is responding. Because it's hyper vigilant to these signals of sex in the social environment, and it's just sort of a residual effect of that working over tens of thousands of years.
Got it. Cool. Well, we are exactly out of time, so we should stop. But this has been fascinating stuff. If you're interested in reading more about the cognitive science of sexual perversion, you should check out Jesse's new book, Perv, which will hit bookstands when, Jesse?
I think October 8th is the release date.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us on the Mind Report. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Laurie. Take care.
Bye.